50 years ago this weekend, the Beatles invaded America, appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show, right? The 7th of February, 1964. And it's been a major point of celebration. We all know the influence that the Beatles had on the music and the culture. What about the filmmaking output of the Beatles? A mixed bag?
I love Help. I love Help. I won't lie to you. I love Help.
Well,
I just love that.
Just to let people know, I did an article on filmicability.blogspot.com, which goes over about 30, maybe a little bit more, 30 Beatles-related films, some of them that they were in, often, some, of course, all of their major films while they were together, but also their post-Beatles careers, and also the films that really they didn't appear in or have anything to do with except lending their music to it, or sometimes their image. So that's on filmicability.blogspot.com, and you can check that out now. And by the way, if you want to, just to throw this in there, I've put a button up there for my GoFundMe site, Help Dean Treadway Get to Boston, and that's there. So if you feel like putting a donation in, please do that. That's right there on Filmicability as well. That said, okay, well, first of all, they did the greatest rock and roll movie that's ever been made, at least narrative film, and that's Hard Day's Night. I mean, it completely changed. It completely became part of like. Before that, rock and roll movies were. I mean, I think generally before that, the most intelligent rock and roll movie that had come out may have been, The Girl Can't Help It, or maybe High School Confidential or something like that, if you want to stretch it. But this was a cut above, Beach Blanket Bingo and so forth like that, things like that. So this was something completely different. I mean, the screenplay was witty and urbane, and the filmmaking was something that people had never seen before. I mean, if you look at that film and you look at the quality of the editing and the photography of it, it looks like something that's completely of today. And then you match that in there with Lester's inventive direction, and then the performances of the four guys and the music that's in it and all that stuff swirling around in it, plus the supporting characters in it too, Wilford Bramble and so forth. All of that mixing in together just makes it like just unassailable as the greatest rock and roll movie ever made. After that, it becomes a little bit more of a mixed bag. Definitely. I mean, what do you guys think?
I think so too. But what fascinates me are this generation, how they look at the Beatles, especially in documentary form. I mean, that George Harrison doc was definitely one of my favorite movies that year. Did. But then this past year, that good old Frida, I finally watched that on Netflix last week, and I was so thoroughly entertained by that movie. It's such a great portrait of this woman who had such a pivotal role in music and cultural history, and she's terribly unassuming. Like, no one knows that she had that major role, as the Beatles secretary. It's a great portrait, and you do get a sense of the complete mania that surrounded them and what it must have been like to be a part of that world.
Right.
It's a different world. I mean, I can't imagine we can't imagine the culture now as it is without the Beatles.
Yeah.
But in terms of their personal output on film, I mean, A Hard Day's Night is the shining example, and everything's kind of downhill from there in various degrees of quality. I didn't see. Did any of you guys ever see that Paul McCartney solo film, Give My Regards to Broad Street, in the 80s?
Oh, yeah.
Parts of it on cable one night.
Movie. That's a bad movie. That's like, McCartney is largely responsible for Magical Mystery Tour, which was the first and maybe the only hiccup in their career together in those 10 years. But when you go back and take a look at something like Give My Regards to Broad Street, which he also had a major hand in as a writer and a producer and so forth. He wasn't necessarily the director, but that's a complete mess too, like a complete lazy sort of no screenplay sort of mess, that's not funny and it's not and there's no good music in it and so forth. I mean, at least Magical Mystery Tour had the music and a couple of good scenes. That one has really nothing. I mean, that's one of the worst. Although there's a nice animated film called Rupert and the Frog Song that was released with it. That was released as kind of a short film before it. That also is controlled largely by Paul McCartney. That's actually quite good. But yeah, I mean, like that's a terrible film. I mean, the best. I mean, other than Yellow Submarine, the great animated film that they, that the Beatles really
awesome.
had a lot to do with. I mean, except for contributing some songs and doing an on-screen cameo for like 2 minutes, but still, that movie somehow captures, the essence of their wit and the sort of the joyous quality of their music through that great animation. But other than that, probably the greatest. I mean, and I like Help too, but it's problematic. It gets a little dull in the middle of it, I think, because it gets.
What about the animated series they did? What about the animated series? The Beatles.
Yeah,
remember those little cartoons?
Sure.
The Beatles.
I talk about that on the site too, and I did forget about good old Frida, so I'll have to go back in and add that. But the Beatles cartoon was a lot of fun, and
I loved watching that.
Yeah,
it's not great, but it was fun. When you're 6 years old, that's awesome. I mean,
yeah.
You know what though? I didn't see the CNN documentary, the one that Tom Hanks produced. The British Invasion that just came on last week. Did either of you guys see that?
No, I didn't even know about that. Okay, wow, all right.
Yeah, I didn't know about that either.
I heard
that covers more than the Beatles, I guess, huh?
No, I think it's about the Beatles, but I think it's only like an hour long. I don't know. I didn't get to watch it, but
I'll have
Aaron
to check that out. Okay.
Aaron watched it and said he liked it very much, and he's like a huge Beatles nerd.
Mm. Well, I've been a fan of theirs, ever since I was a little kid, and but I was going to say the other great Beatles movie is something that they really didn't have anything to do with, and that's I Want to Hold Your Hand from 1978, the Robert Zemeckis film, which would be a great film to watch tonight if anybody out there can find it. I'm not sure if it's still in print. I have a DVD copy of it, but that film, which was Robert Zemeckis' first film, produced by Steven Spielberg and co-written by Bob Gale, who he co-wrote, Back to the Future and Used Cars in 1941 with. That movie is just an insane, like kind of juggernaut of laughs all the way through. It's got a great cast of there's a lot of people in the cast that that haven't really gone on to a lot of bigger things. I'd say the biggest star in the cast is maybe Nancy Allen. But everybody, Wendy Jo Sperber, Eddie Deason, Bobby DiCiccio, and Teresa Saldana, who was also in Raging Bull, and Susan Kendall Newman, Mark McClure, who was in Superman as Jimmy Olsen. Like all these guys are just hilarious in it, and it's just a 90-minute kind of trifle about a bunch of Jersey kids trying to break into the Ed Sullivan Theater to see this show. And it's really inventive in how it uses the music, and it's particularly inventive in how it uses the Beatles images, because obviously they didn't participate in the filming of the movie. So when it comes time for the big show, you'll see how Zemeckis uses the images from the Ed Sullivan show that we all saw, or that everybody's seen. You'll see how he inventively shoehorns those images into the film by putting it in very inventive places. So that in itself is funny and great, But I just think I Want to Hold Your Hand is just something that just every Beatles fan should see. But when you get to things like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Wonderwall, and even a lot of Ringo Starr's movies are terrible, except for maybe The Magic Christian and Caveman. That's not so great. But interestingly, the most interesting person that came out of the Beatles, in the realm of film at least, was actually George Harrison. He was the only person that actually had any kind of filmmaking savvy, really, because he started handmade films in the 80s or in the late 70s with Monty Python's Life of Brian, and then went on to release, movies like Mona Lisa and Time Bandits and Withnail and I, and How to Get Ahead in Advertising. All of these really, all of those are really great movies, and he had his hand in Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, and even 127 Hours, many years later. Right. So he's the one guy that really came out and actually knew.
He's the unsung hero.
Play around film. Yeah.
He's the unsung hero of the Beatles, because for the longest time, people always focused on John, Paul, and it really turned out, especially that great documentary, he's really the unsung hero of the whole thing. He's really the genius, I sometimes think, really, of the whole Beatles thing. He wasn't. I don't always felt he was given the credit he deserved during his lifetime, but he really was the one of the real, the backbone of that whole band.
There seemed to be with he and John Lennon. There seemed to be a searching in their art, like a searching to get to another place, to kind of plumb the depths and find another level that I don't necessarily find in McCarthy's work since the Beatles. McCarthy, he came out with an acclaimed original album.
McCartney.
Yeah, McCartney, isn't that what I said?
You said McCarthy.
McCarthy.
Oh, okay. Well, back to Joe McCarthy. He really, the whole communist thing. Yeah, he came out with an original album last year that was majorly acclaimed, and I think the album before that was like songs from his childhood. I think he goes back to kind of the classical level of songwriting, and I don't sense a lot of exploration, but there was a lot of exploration and searching for meaning in the music of Lennon and Harrison.
I definitely agree. And with Harrison, you have to wonder. You have to know that Harrison, suffered a lot in the Beatles because he was kind of shunted into the background a lot, and and part of I think the reason that they broke up is because he just couldn't let that happen anymore. He just couldn't sit around and just have two songs on every album. That just wasn't going to stand for very long. So, and you have to give him a lot of credit for keeping his mouth shut in a lot of ways. But if you look at Let It Be, for instance, which, by the way, I found is available on YouTube. I was surprised. I've looked for it for years, and it's been notoriously hard to find. And who knows, it might be taken down soon. But it's up there right now, and I have a link to it on the article. But you look at Let It Be and his reactions to Paul McCartney trying to give him directions, and he just says, look, I'll play it any way you want me to. If you want me to play it this way, I'll play it this way. If you want me to play it this way, I'll play it that way. I'll do anything you want. And you just feel that tension in that studio room, and that's one of the things that makes that a particularly discomforting kind of movie to watch. But But yeah, so
okay.
I mean, it must have taken extreme fortitude for him to still keep working and kind of keep his mouth shut.